The millionaire CEO was calmly sipping his coffee in his office when a little girl's desperate scream outside his door stopped the entire building, and nothing in his life made sense after that moment. Charles Bennett began his morning the way he always did, early, sharp, and uninterrupted. The skyline spread wide outside his 34th-floor office window, painted in golden tones by the rising sun. His assistant had already brought in his usual double espresso, his tie was immaculate, and the financial report on his tablet glowed with perfect numbers. It was a routine Charles relied on, a daily structure that kept his life neat, professional, and completely controlled. That control shattered the moment a high-pitched scream pierced the quiet air outside his office. He looked up immediately, frowning, unsure if what he heard was real. Another scream followed, unmistakably a child's voice. It echoed down the marble-lined corridor just beyond his office door. Charles stood and moved toward the sound. As he opened the door, he was met with a scene that felt surreal. A security guard was standing in the reception area, holding back a small girl who was struggling in his grasp. She couldn't have been more than 6. She had wavy blonde hair that framed her round face in disarray, and large brown eyes that were wide with panic. Her small fists were clenched, her voice hoarse from shouting. "Let me go. I need to talk to him," she cried, trying to wrench herself free. The guard noticed Charles and looked apologetic. "Sir," she ran past the front desk. "Says she knows you. I was just escorting her out." The girl caught sight of Charles and immediately stopped struggling. Her gaze locked on him, and she froze as if time had stopped. Her bottom lip trembled. "You're Mr. Bennett," she said softly, breathless, like she had just finished a race. Charles stepped closer, still confused. "Yes, I am. Who are you?" The girl swallowed hard and took a small step forward. "My name is Ellie. My mommy is in the hospital. She said if anything ever happened, I should come find you." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she reached into the backpack slung over one shoulder, pulling out a folded photograph. Her hands were shaking as she handed it to him. Charles unfolded the photo and felt his entire body go still. It was him, 10 years younger, arm around a woman he had not seen in 6 years. Julia. She was smiling, and so was he, frozen in a moment that felt like a lifetime ago. Charles looked up from the photograph, suddenly seeing the resemblance in Ellie's eyes, in the shape of her mouth. His heart thudded, once, hard. "My mom is Julia," Ellie said, her voice now barely above a whisper. "She said if she couldn't talk, I should come to you. She said you would help. Please, please don't send me away." The security guard looked to Charles for direction, clearly uncertain. Charles couldn't speak right away. His throat had gone dry. He looked at Ellie again and saw something he hadn't expected, something fragile and urgent and real. Without thinking, he nodded. "It's okay," he said to the guard. "She's staying. She's with me." And with that sentence, his entire world quietly, and irrevocably, shifted. Charles stood frozen in the middle of the lobby as Ellie's words echoed inside him. Nothing about the moment made sense, and yet every instinct told him it was real. The photograph in his hand confirmed it. There he was, younger and more relaxed, with his arm wrapped around Julia's waist. She was smiling at the camera, her hair windblown, and his expression, once unfamiliar to him, now stared back with a kind of intimacy that made his chest tighten. He remembered that weekend. They had gone to the coast for no reason, rented a small cottage, stayed up late talking about everything and nothing. It had been one of the last times he'd let himself be fully present in someone else's world. And then he left. He looked down at the little girl who was now standing quietly beside him, holding the strap of her backpack with one hand and rubbing her eye with the other. She looked tired. Not just from running into his office, but with the kind of exhaustion that children shouldn't carry. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, cautious but hopeful. "She told me your name," she said again, quieter now. "She told me you used to be important to her." That word, used to be, landed with more weight than he expected. He gently placed the photo on the reception desk and crouched down to Ellie's level. "Where is your mom now?" he asked, carefully. "What happened?" Ellie fidgeted, then pulled a crumpled note from her coat pocket. "The hospital gave me this. She fainted at work and wouldn't wake up. Someone called an ambulance. I was at school, and then I waited, but no one came to pick me up. So I went home, and then I remembered what she said." Charles took the paper from her and scanned it. It was a discharge summary from the emergency room, signed with Julia's name and an urgent message scribbled at the bottom: "If anything happens to me, find Charles Bennett." There was an address and nothing else. It didn't explain what she had, how bad it was, or who had been watching Ellie in the meantime. And the worst part was, she had apparently trusted that he, someone she hadn't spoken to in years, would step up. He stood and looked at the guard, who was now clearly uncomfortable. "Tell Elise to clear my afternoon," Charles said, his voice calm but firm. "And have the car brought around." The guard hesitated. "Sir, are you sure?" "Yes," Charles cut in, gently placing a hand on Ellie's shoulder. "We're going to the hospital." Ellie didn't say anything on the elevator ride down. She stayed close to his side, holding her bear-shaped keychain in both hands. Charles glanced at her more than once, trying to understand how he could have possibly missed this. Julia had been gone from his life for 6 years, and in that time she had carried a child, raised her, protected her, and never once reached out. Why? Was it pride? Pain? Or had she simply assumed he wouldn't care? When the car pulled up to the emergency entrance of St. Mary's Hospital, Charles helped Ellie out and led her inside. The woman at the reception desk looked up and blinked in surprise when she saw him. He was used to that, his face occasionally appeared in the business news, but this wasn't a boardroom. He explained who he was, gave Julia's full name, and waited as the woman tapped at her keyboard. "She was admitted this morning," she confirmed. "Internal bleeding. She's in observation. No visitors allowed yet except family." Charles hesitated. He didn't know if he had the right to say it. But then Ellie stepped forward and whispered, "He is family." The receptionist paused for a long moment, then nodded slowly and gestured toward the waiting area. "Take a seat. A nurse will update you when she's stable." Charles led Ellie to one of the plastic chairs and sat down beside her. She curled up next to him, hugging her backpack, her legs drawn to her chest. He looked at her again, really looked. The way she tilted her head, the curve of her mouth when she frowned, even the small, focused crease between her brows, all of it reminded him of Julia. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about quarterly targets or investor calls or mergers. He was thinking about a woman he'd once loved, and the child he never knew he had, now asleep against his side. Charles sat silently in the waiting room, the noise of hospital monitors and intercom announcements distant and muffled compared to the weight of the child leaning against his side. Ellie had fallen asleep, her head resting just below his shoulder, her small body curled in a way that told him she'd done this before, waited, worried, endured in silence. He kept his arm gently around her, unsure if it was for her comfort or his own. The sterile white walls, the scent of disinfectant, the ticking clock on the far wall, everything reminded him that this wasn't just a detour in his day anymore. This was something irreversible. Something he couldn't walk away from, even if he wanted to. A nurse finally approached with cautious steps and a clipboard hugged to her chest. She glanced down at Ellie before addressing Charles quietly. "You're listed as emergency contact," she said. "Ms. Davis is stable. She regained consciousness about 20 minutes ago. She's still weak, but coherent." Charles exhaled without realizing he'd been holding his breath. "What happened?" The nurse hesitated. "There's a history of untreated anemia. She collapsed at work. She lost a lot of blood before paramedics arrived. We're giving her transfusions now, and we'll keep her overnight for monitoring. She was lucky her daughter didn't panic. Her eyes flicked briefly to Ellie, still asleep. That little girl kept calm, remembered your name and address. That's not nothing. Charles nodded slowly. The nurse led him down a hallway while another nurse stayed with Ellie. With every step toward the recovery room, he felt the weight of old choices pressing harder against his spine. The last time he had seen Julia, there were no dramatic goodbyes, no tears, just a final disagreement and an unspoken understanding that their lives were heading in different directions. She had been disappointed, yes, but she hadn't begged. And he had assumed that silence meant closure. Now he realized it had been something else entirely. When he stepped into her room, the light was low and Julia looked impossibly small in the hospital bed. Her skin was pale, her hair disheveled against the pillow, but her eyes were the same, sharp and steady and unafraid. She looked at him and didn't speak right away. For a moment, they just studied each other as though trying to account for 6 years in a single glance. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said finally, her voice hoarse but clear. "Ellie said she found you. I didn't think she'd remember the name." Charles stepped closer to the bed, unable to form words. "She said I'm her father," he said at last, more a question than a statement. Julia gave a slow nod. "She's 6. I found out I was pregnant not long after we split. I didn't call you because I didn't know if you'd want to know. You were already gone." Her eyes didn't accuse him. They just told the truth. "I should have known," he said quietly. "I should have asked. I should have." Julia shook her head slightly. "There's no point going backward. You're here now. That's what matters to her." For a moment, neither of them spoke. There were too many missing pieces, too many years to fill in. But Charles felt something settle inside him, something raw and painful but honest. "She's incredible," he said. "Smart. Brave. She showed up at my office like she was on a mission." Julia smiled faintly, a flicker of pride in her tired expression. "She is brave. She gets that from me." Then, softer, "But she watches people the way you do." Charles pulled the chair closer to the bed. "What happens now?" he asked. "What do you need?" Julia looked at him, not just as an old love or a past mistake, but as a man who was trying to show up, finally. "Right now, I need to rest. And Ellie needs someone to take her home and make sure she eats something that isn't vending machine food." Charles stood and nodded. "I can do that." He started toward the door, but paused. "I'd like to be part of her life. I don't know how to do this. But I want to learn. If you'll let me." Julia looked at him a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet breath, she said, "Then don't just say it. Show it." As he walked back down the hall to find Ellie, Charles felt the weight of that final sentence settle into his bones. Not a challenge. A chance. A doorway he had never opened before. And this time, he didn't intend to close it. Charles returned to the waiting area to find Ellie still asleep, curled on the chair with her jacket as a makeshift blanket and her small backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. He sat down quietly beside her, watching the rise and fall of her breath, struck by how peaceful she looked despite everything she'd endured in the last 24 hours. It amazed him that she had navigated a crisis most adults would crumble under, guided only by a name and a photograph. That strength wasn't just a product of survival, it was clearly something Julia had instilled in her. After a few minutes, Ellie stirred. Her eyes blinked open, still cloudy with sleep, and when she saw him sitting beside her, she didn't jump or question it. She simply said, "Is she okay?" Charles nodded slowly. "She's awake. The doctors are taking care of her. She asked me to take you home and make sure you eat something better than hospital snacks." Ellie seemed to consider that, then sat up and rubbed her eyes. "Do you know how to make pancakes?" she asked. The question surprised him. He expected tears or silence, not breakfast requests. "I haven't made pancakes in a while," he admitted. "But I'm willing to try if you'll supervise." On the drive to her apartment, Ellie stared out the window, quiet but calm. She wasn't afraid of him, and that surprised Charles more than anything. She didn't treat him like a stranger. In fact, her presence had a natural ease to it, as if she had somehow already decided that he belonged in her world. At a red light, he looked over and asked, "Do you want to talk about what happened today?" Ellie shrugged. "Not really. Mom gets sick sometimes. This one was just worse." There was no drama in her tone, just the matter-of-fact voice of a child who had learned how to live through uncertainty. He nodded and let the silence return. Her apartment was small, clean, and filled with signs of a life built on effort. There were drawings on the fridge held up with mismatched magnets, a pair of rain boots by the door, a couch that looked older than Ellie but clearly loved. He helped her unpack her bag, found cereal in the cupboard and milk that hadn't expired, and managed to scramble some eggs. She insisted on setting the table, even though it was just the two of them, and then asked him questions between bites: how old he was, what kind of car he drove, whether he liked dogs. It was surreal. She didn't ask about why he hadn't been there, at least not yet, but he knew that question would come. For now, she was trying to understand him in pieces, one small curiosity at a time. After lunch, Ellie pulled out a box of puzzles and invited him to help. They sat on the floor, arranging corners and edges, working quietly but side by side. It wasn't just about the puzzle. It was about time, about space, about testing whether he would stay. When the final piece clicked into place, she smiled and said, "That was faster than when I do it alone." Charles felt something warm spread through his chest. "Everything's easier when you have someone helping you," he replied. She nodded and leaned back on her hands. "Mom says that too." As the afternoon light shifted through the windows, Charles helped her pack an overnight bag to bring back to the hospital, along with one of her favorite books and a small stuffed bear with a worn-out ribbon. He asked if she wanted to go back with him to see her mom again. She hesitated, then nodded. "But only if you promise to hold my hand in the elevator. I don't like the beeping sounds." He held out his hand without a word. She took it and didn't let go. That evening, when they stepped into Julia's room again, Ellie ran to her mother's side and climbed into the chair beside the bed. Charles stood back at first, watching them, but Julia motioned for him to come closer. She looked tired but stronger, her skin no longer as pale, her eyes clearer. "You did okay today," she said softly. He didn't smile, but he felt her words settle into something inside him he didn't know had been empty. "We did okay," he said. Then he looked down at Ellie, her hand wrapped around Julia's fingers and the other still loosely holding his. He realized that this wasn't just one day of stepping in. It was the beginning of staying. And for the first time in years, he didn't want to be anywhere else. The following days unfolded in a way Charles hadn't anticipated. What began as a single act of responsibility had grown into something deeper, something he couldn't compartmentalize or schedule around. Julia remained in the hospital under observation, her condition steadily improving but still requiring rest. With no close relatives nearby and her closest friend out of state, Charles became the person responsible for Ellie, not just legally, but emotionally. And surprisingly, he didn't resist it. He embraced it with a quiet determination, although everything about it felt new and unsteady. Ellie had returned to her usual routine of school during the day, but now Charles was the one picking her up. The first morning he tried, he arrived 10 minutes early, unsure of where to stand or what to say. He stayed near the gate, watching other parents chatting, greeting each other with the comfort of repetition. He felt out of place, an outsider who wore his confusion behind an expensive coat and polished shoes. But then Ellie spotted him from across the playground, ran toward him with her backpack bouncing behind her, and smiled like seeing him there was the most natural thing in the world. That smile grounded him more than any boardroom ever had. Back at Julia's apartment, he began adapting to the rhythms of life with a child. Mornings were filled with cereal spills, missing shoes, and debates over which cartoon should be playing in the background. Evenings were slower, homework he didn't understand but tried to help with anyway, simple dinners made together with more laughter than accuracy, and stories read aloud with voices that made Ellie giggle until she fell asleep with her cheek against his arm. The simplicity of the routine became sacred. Each moment stitched into his day a clarity he hadn't known he needed. At night, once Ellie was asleep, Charles would sit in the living room and go through emails, but he no longer answered most of them. He paused at messages from board members or investors, sometimes typing replies only to delete them. For the first time in his life, work didn't feel urgent. What felt urgent was whether Ellie had remembered her lunch for school, or if Julia's chart showed improvement, or if Ellie's stuffed bear, which she now insisted Charles tuck into bed, had been fluffed properly. He visited Julia each evening after dinner, bringing Ellie with him unless she was too tired. Each visit felt less awkward than the last. Julia watched him carefully in those moments, not just with curiosity but with cautious trust. They spoke about practical things at first, Ellie's bedtime, medications, bills, but eventually, the conversations drifted. She asked him about his company, and he told her honestly how hard it was to concentrate. He asked her what she planned to do when she got home, and she admitted she hadn't thought past tomorrow. There was no pressure in their words, no weight of needing to define what this new shape between them was becoming. But it was becoming something. That much was clear. One night, as Charles and Ellie were leaving the hospital, she reached for his hand without being prompted. As they walked to the car, she said, "Mom says I'm brave, but I think you're learning to be too." He stopped walking for a moment, taken off guard by the simplicity of her words. Then he squeezed her hand gently and nodded. "I think you might be right." She grinned, swinging his hand slightly, as if that settled the matter completely. Back at the apartment, after Ellie had fallen asleep and the dishes were cleared, Charles sat in the dim light of the kitchen and thought about everything he'd built in his life that now seemed so far away. His penthouse, his board meetings, his title, all of it paled in comparison to the quiet peace of brushing Ellie's hair back before bed, or the half-smile Julia gave him whenever he made her laugh. He realized he hadn't just stepped into their world. He had been welcomed into it. And now he couldn't imagine walking away. The sixth morning began with rain. A steady, drumming kind that tapped gently against the windows of Julia's apartment and made the world outside look softer, quieter. Inside, the living room was filled with the scent of cinnamon toast and the sound of Ellie's feet hopping between tile patterns on the floor, pretending they were stepping stones over lava. Charles stood at the kitchen counter pouring orange juice, wearing a wrinkled white shirt and mismatched socks, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't care that he looked disheveled. He was beginning to understand that there was a kind of power in being present rather than polished. When Ellie sat down at the table, she asked if she could visit her mother again after school. Charles said yes without hesitation. He had already planned to pick her up and drive straight to the hospital, even before she asked. The way Ellie checked her backpack twice before leaving, the way she tucked her small sketchbook inside to show her mom a new drawing, it was clear she had built her week around those short hospital visits. He understood now that consistency was more important than perfection, and that being there, every day, mattered more than any apology could. After he dropped Ellie at school, Charles sat in his car longer than usual, his hands still on the wheel, thinking about Julia. Her condition had stabilized enough that doctors expected her to be discharged in a few days. The news should have brought relief, but instead, it stirred a storm of uncertainty inside him. He knew she would need help, real, ongoing help, not just rides to appointments or meals reheated from frozen trays. She would need rest, support, and most of all, someone she could rely on without question. He had never been that person before. But he wanted to be now. Later that day, after picking up Ellie and grabbing her favorite cookies from a nearby bakery, they arrived at the hospital just before sunset. Julia was sitting up in bed when they entered, pale but smiling. Her hair had been washed and combed back, and though her frame still looked fragile beneath the hospital blanket, there was color in her cheeks again. Ellie climbed onto the edge of the bed and pulled out her sketchbook, talking so quickly about her school day that the words nearly tripped over each other. Julia listened, her hand resting gently on her daughter's knee, nodding, laughing softly, occasionally glancing at Charles with a kind of quiet gratitude. After Ellie ran down the hall with a nurse to grab a juice box, Charles sat in the chair beside Julia's bed. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. Then she turned toward him and said, "You've done more than I expected." Her voice wasn't accusing, but honest. "You didn't owe us anything. You didn't even know she existed." Charles looked at her, steady and certain. "Maybe I didn't owe you something in the past," he said carefully. "But I do now. And it's not because I feel guilty. It's because this, being with her, helping you, it's the only thing that's made sense in years." Julia watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "I don't know how to rebuild something that never really existed," she said softly. "I don't want to confuse her, or myself. I don't want to pretend like time didn't pass." "We can't rewrite what happened," Charles replied. "But maybe we can write something new. If you let me." He expected resistance, some wall to go up, but instead Julia sighed and leaned her head back against the pillow. "It's not just about letting you. It's about trusting you. Not just when things are convenient, but when they're hard." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll show you, every day, that I mean it." Just then, Ellie ran back into the room, juice box in hand and cheeks flushed with excitement. She plopped into the chair between them and announced, "Mom says I can teach you how to braid hair." Charles blinked, surprised, and Julia laughed. "I may have mentioned your styling skills need some work." Charles raised both hands. "Fair enough. I'll accept the training." That night, as they left the hospital, Ellie asked if he would still be there when her mom came home. Without hesitation, he said, "I will." And when she slipped her hand into his as they crossed the parking lot, he felt it again, that quiet, powerful shift inside him. The kind that didn't make noise, but changed everything. 3 days later, Julia was discharged from the hospital. The morning was bright and cloudless, a quiet contrast to the uncertainty that had shaped the past week. Charles had made sure everything at the apartment was ready, fresh sheets on the bed, groceries in the fridge, and medications picked up and sorted neatly into a pill organizer. He even fixed the flickering light in the hallway, something Julia had apparently been ignoring for months. He wasn't trying to impress her. He simply wanted her to come home and feel like she could rest. Not like she had to return to survival mode. Ellie was waiting at the front door when Charles brought Julia home. The little girl bounced on her toes with nervous energy, wearing a crown made of paper and glue, which she insisted was to welcome her queen. When the door opened and Julia stepped inside, slower than usual but smiling, Ellie ran to hug her, wrapping her small arms gently around her waist. Julia closed her eyes and held her daughter close, her expression softening in a way Charles hadn't seen before. It was the kind of reunion that was quiet, not dramatic, but filled with all the emotion they hadn't let themselves feel earlier. Julia took slow steps through the apartment, reacquainting herself with her own space, and seemed surprised by how much it already looked and felt like more than a place to sleep. There were little changes, blankets folded differently, dishes rearranged, Ellie's drawings framed on the wall in simple dollar store frames. "You did all this?" she asked, glancing over at Charles. He nodded, almost sheepishly. "I figured you shouldn't come home to chaos." She didn't say thank you out loud, but the way she looked at him said enough. That first night was different. Charles stayed late, helping Julia get settled while Ellie insisted on making dinner. Dinner, in her case, meant peanut butter sandwiches cut into star shapes, carrot sticks, and juice poured carefully with both hands. They sat at the table together, 3 people who had once been strangers now forming something tentative and real. There were moments of silence, but none of them were uncomfortable. It felt like breathing had become easier for all of them, like some invisible thread had pulled them into alignment without anyone needing to force it. Later that evening, Charles offered to read Ellie her bedtime story while Julia took her first proper shower in days. Ellie chose a book about a magical forest and climbed into bed with her stuffed bear tucked beneath one arm. As he read, she interrupted with questions, half of which didn't relate to the story, but he answered each one anyway. When the book ended, she turned to him and said, "Are you going to stay tomorrow too?" He hesitated for just a second. "If it's okay with your mom," he replied. She nodded, satisfied. "I think she wants you to." Then she reached up and touched his cheek in a way that was unguarded, trusting. "You're a good reader," she said, before curling into her pillow and closing her eyes. Charles sat there for a while, watching her breathe, thinking about how strange it was to love someone so quickly and so deeply that it frightened you. But he didn't pull away. He stayed until her breathing grew steady. When he stepped out of Ellie's room, Julia was sitting on the couch in fresh pajamas, hair damp, a cup of tea between her hands. She looked rested, but wary. Charles joined her without asking. They sat in silence again, but it was the kind that invited honesty. Finally, she spoke. "You've changed. You listen more. You're not always looking past the moment like you used to." Charles looked down at his hands. "I had to lose a lot before I realized what mattered. But even when I had everything, I felt like something was missing. Now, for the first time, I don't." Julia studied him for a moment, then took a sip of her tea. "I don't know what this is between us. I'm not ready to name it. But I do know that Ellie needs you. And I need you too. In a way I didn't expect." Charles met her eyes. "Then let's not rush to name it. Let's just build it. One piece at a time." She nodded slowly. "Okay." That night, Charles didn't go back to his penthouse. He slept on the couch, blanket over him, Ellie's stuffed bear sitting on the coffee table like a silent guardian. And when morning came, with the smell of toast and laughter from the kitchen, he woke up to something he hadn't known he craved, a life that wasn't perfect, but finally felt like home. A month passed, and life settled into a rhythm none of them had expected but all of them quietly embraced. Charles no longer kept his phone on during dinner. He stopped checking emails before bed. His team had adjusted to his reduced presence at the office, and though some questioned his shift in priorities, most understood that something in him had changed. And not in a scandalous, dramatic way, but in the way a person begins to show up for their life instead of racing past it. He still worked, still made decisions and took calls, but his hours were shorter, his boundaries firmer, and his evenings reserved for something far more important than boardrooms. Julia's recovery progressed steadily. The color returned to her face, her movements grew stronger, and she started taking walks with Ellie after school. She and Charles often stood together at the window, watching Ellie skip ahead on the sidewalk, talking to herself, the way kids do when they feel safe. Sometimes Julia would glance at Charles with that quiet smile she gave only when she thought he wasn't looking. And sometimes, he caught it anyway. They didn't talk about what they were, or what they might become, because there was something sacred about the way things were unfolding without labels. They lived in the moment, careful not to break the fragile trust that had taken so long to rebuild. One Saturday afternoon, they visited the park together. Ellie insisted on a picnic, packing sandwiches she helped make and lemonade she poured into mismatched cups. She brought her sketchbook too, and halfway through lunch, she handed Charles a drawing. It showed 3 figures again, this time clearer. A tall man, a woman in a red dress, and a girl holding both their hands. Above them, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "My family." Charles blinked hard, looking at the paper longer than necessary. Julia reached over and gently squeezed his hand beneath the blanket. It was a simple moment, but to him, it felt monumental. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting golden streaks through the trees, Ellie ran off to chase a butterfly. Julia and Charles stayed on the blanket, the silence between them full but unspoken. Finally, she leaned her head on his shoulder. It was the first time she'd touched him like that since the hospital. No discussion. No warning. Just quiet closeness that meant more than any speech could. He placed his hand over hers. No promises, no dramatic declarations, just presence. Commitment without pressure. He would stay. He already had. That evening, as they walked home, Ellie held both of their hands. She looked up at Charles and asked, "Do you think we'll always be like this?" He looked down at her and smiled softly. "I hope so," he said. "And I'll do my best to make sure of it." She seemed satisfied with that answer, skipping ahead again. When they got home, Ellie ran to her room to change into pajamas while Julia and Charles cleaned up the last of the picnic leftovers. In the kitchen, surrounded by crumbs and the fading smell of peanut butter and lemonade, she turned to him and said, "I don't think I could have done this without you." He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Maybe you could have. But I'm grateful you didn't have to." She nodded, eyes glistening, and leaned in to kiss his cheek. That night, after Ellie was asleep and the apartment had quieted, Charles stood in the hallway between her bedroom and the living room. He looked at the home around him, the toys on the floor, the half-folded laundry on the couch, the list of groceries pinned to the fridge, and felt a kind of peace he hadn't known was possible. It wasn't flashy or perfect. It wasn't the kind of success he could measure with numbers or praise. But it was real. And it was his. He didn't need the title or the corner office or the endless chase anymore. What he needed was here. In this home. With them. A place not defined by what he had left behind, but by what he had finally decided to hold on to. In the end, this story isn't about a millionaire or a grand twist, it's about quiet redemption, the kind that doesn't come with applause but with presence. What moved me most was how Charles didn't fix everything with money or grand gestures, but by simply showing up, staying when it was uncomfortable, and allowing himself to be transformed by connection. He didn't reclaim a past, he built something entirely new. And perhaps that's the most powerful kind of healing, not erasing the mistakes, but choosing, day by day, to be better than them. The rain poured down as Alex Carter stood stranded, waiting for his driver. Frustrated, he was about to make a run for it when a small hand tugged at his sleeve. "Here, mister," a little girl said, holding out a bright pink umbrella. He took it, his gaze catching on her striking blue eyes, his blue eyes. Then, through the rain, he saw her. The woman he never thought he'd see again. And in that moment, everything changed. The rain came down in heavy sheets, drenching the city streets in a matter of seconds. Alexander Carter had spent the entire day locked in meetings, moving from one business deal to the next without a moment's pause. He had barely looked up from his phone when he stepped outside the towering headquarters of Carter Enterprises, expecting his driver to be waiting as usual. But as soon as he felt the icy rain soak through his tailored suit, he realized something was wrong. His driver was late. Cursing under his breath, Alex glanced around for shelter, but the storm had already flooded the sidewalks. People hurried past him, their umbrellas barely holding up against the wind. His office building was behind him, but walking back inside would mean enduring the stares of his employees, *** the CEO, caught in the rain like an ordinary man ***. He didn't like appearing vulnerable, not even in something as trivial as bad weather. Then, just as he was about to make a run for it, a small figure caught his attention. A little girl stood near the entrance of a small convenience store, huddled under an awning. She couldn't have been older than 6, with long, dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. Her blue eyes, bright and clear, stood out against the gloom of the storm. She clutched a tiny pink umbrella in her hands, one that was clearly meant for a child, not an adult. Alex wouldn't have stopped if she hadn't moved toward him. "Here, mister," she said softly, stretching the umbrella toward him. "You'll get all wet." Alex blinked, momentarily thrown off by the unexpected gesture. He wasn't used to people helping him, especially not strangers, especially not a child. He glanced at the tiny umbrella, then at the girl, who was looking up at him with nothing but quiet kindness. You'll get wet, he pointed out, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. She shrugged, as if it didn't matter. I can wait for my mommy under the awning. Something about the way she said it made his chest tighten. There was a quiet confidence in her voice, the kind that came from a child who had learned to take care of herself in ways she probably shouldn't have. He hesitated only a moment before taking the umbrella, holding it carefully above his head. What's your name? He asked. Lily. He nodded, glancing toward the store. And where's your mom? She works here, Lily answered, pointing toward the convenience store behind her. She's inside, but she'll be out soon. Alex looked through the rain-streaked glass. The store was small, barely more than a corner shop, and from what he could tell, only one person was working inside. He couldn't see her clearly, but something about the situation unsettled him. He had never thought much about the people who worked in places like this, people who spent hours behind counters while the rest of the city rushed past them without a second glance. He exhaled, adjusting his grip on the tiny umbrella. Your mom works late. Lily nodded. Sometimes. I wait for her here, but it's okay. I don't mind. Alex felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest. He didn't know why it bothered him so much, why he was standing here having a conversation with a child in the middle of a storm. But something about her, about the way she spoke so matter-of-factly, about the way she had handed him an umbrella without expecting anything in return, made it impossible for him to walk away. For a man who had spent years building walls around himself, it was an unfamiliar feeling. Before he could say anything else, the door to the store swung open. And the moment he saw the woman who stepped outside, everything inside him froze. His breath caught in his throat, his grip tightening instinctively around the umbrella. Because standing there, looking just as stunned as he felt, was Hannah White. A woman he hadn't seen in 6 years. A woman who had disappeared without a trace. And in that instant, as his gaze flicked from her to Lily, realization slammed into him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just any little girl. This was his daughter. Hannah froze the moment her eyes met Alex's. For a second, she looked as if she might turn and run, but then her gaze flicked to Lily, standing beside him with the small pink umbrella still clutched in her hands. The color drained from her face, and she took an unsteady breath as she stepped forward, her arms instinctively reaching for her daughter. Lily, sweetheart, what are you doing out here? Her voice was soft but tight, like she was struggling to stay composed. Lily smiled up at her. Mommy, I gave him my umbrella. He was getting all wet. Hannah's jaw tightened as she turned her attention back to Alex. I see that. Alex barely heard her. His mind was still reeling from the shock of seeing her again, from the storm of emotions crashing inside him. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as his eyes flickered between Hannah and Lily. The resemblance was undeniable. The same soft brown waves, the same delicate features. But it was the eyes that sealed it. Bright, striking blue. His blue. His entire body went rigid as the realization sank in. Lily wasn't just any little girl. She was his. A wave of anger surged inside him, colliding with the shock that had left him frozen in place. He gripped the umbrella tightly, forcing himself to breathe, to focus. He had 1,000 questions, but none of them seemed to make it past the lump in his throat. Hannah shifted uncomfortably under his stare. Alex, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It had been 6 years. 6 years of silence. 6 years of not knowing. 6 years, and she had never told him. Is she mine? His voice was lower than he intended, steady but filled with something raw and unfiltered. Hannah's breath hitched. Lily looked between them, confusion flickering across her face. Mommy? Hannah knelt down beside her daughter, tucking a damp strand of hair behind her ear. Why don't you go inside, sweetheart? I'll be there in just a minute. Lily hesitated, glancing up at Alex one last time before nodding. She handed him the umbrella with a bright smile. "You can keep this, mister." Something about the way she said it made his chest ache. He forced a smile, his voice gentler when he spoke to her. "Thank you, Lily." She gave him a small wave before stepping into the store. The moment the door shut behind her, the air between him and Hannah grew heavy. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one building inside him. "Answer me," he said, his voice sharper now. "Is she mine?" Hannah let out a slow, shaky breath. "Yes." The word hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, running a hand through his rain-soaked hair. 1,000 emotions fought for dominance: anger, shock, disbelief, grief for the years he had lost. "You never told me." His voice was quiet, but it wasn't soft. Hannah's fingers curled into fists. "I wanted to." He let out a bitter laugh. "But you didn't." She flinched. "Do you have any idea what you took from me?" His voice was rising now, his composure slipping. 6 years, Hannah. 6 years of her life that I'll never get back." Her eyes glistened, but she blinked quickly, forcing herself to stay strong. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Alex's jaw clenched. "The right thing? Keeping my daughter from me?" Tears threatened to spill over, but she shook her head. "You don't understand, Alex. You weren't," she exhaled sharply, gripping the sleeves of her coat. "You weren't the kind of man who wanted a family. Back then, everything was about your career, your company, your next deal. I was afraid that if I told you, you'd resent me for it." He stared at her in disbelief. "So instead, you just disappeared." "I didn't know what else to do." Alex let out a slow breath, trying to steady himself, but the rage was still there, simmering beneath the surface. He had spent years believing Hannah had simply walked away, never knowing that she had been carrying his child. His daughter. A small part of him whispered that maybe she had been right, maybe the man he was back then wouldn't have been ready. But none of that mattered now. Because he was ready now. He straightened, his voice quieter but firm. "I want to know her." Hannah hesitated. "Alex. I'm not asking, Hannah." His voice was unwavering, his decision already made. "She's my daughter, and I'm not walking away from this." Hannah's lips parted slightly, as if she had expected a different reaction. For a moment, she just looked at him, searching his face, trying to read what lay beneath his anger. Then she swallowed, nodding slowly. "Okay." It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. But it was a start. Alex had spent his entire life making calculated decisions. Every business move, every strategic partnership, every investment, he had built his empire by staying in control. But now, for the first time, he was walking into something completely unknown. He had a daughter. A 6-year-old little girl with blue eyes that mirrored his own. A child who had been living her life without him, completely unaware that somewhere out in the world, she had a father. He barely remembered how he got home that night. His mind was racing, thoughts colliding as he tried to process everything. He had been so focused on his work, on expanding his business, on building a future that he thought mattered. And all along, this had been the future he never even knew he had. When Hannah had agreed to let him be a part of Lily's life, he could see the hesitation in her eyes. She didn't trust him yet, and he couldn't blame her. As much as he resented the fact that she had kept Lily a secret from him, he also knew that Hannah had been right about one thing: back then, he probably wouldn't have been ready. But now? Now there was nothing in the world that mattered more than making up for the time he had lost. The next morning, he found himself standing outside the small coffee shop where he and Hannah had agreed to meet. It was a quiet place, tucked between a row of local businesses, nothing like the upscale restaurants he was used to. He wasn't sure what to expect when he stepped inside, but as soon as he spotted them sitting by the window, something inside him shifted. Lily was coloring on a napkin with a red crayon, completely focused on whatever picture she was creating. Hannah sat beside her, a coffee cup in her hands, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on him. For a brief second, she looked uncertain, like she wasn't sure if he would actually show up. He stepped forward, hesitating for only a moment before pulling out the chair across from them. Lily looked up, her blue eyes filled with curiosity but not hesitation. She didn't know who he was yet, didn't realize that the man sitting across from her was supposed to be someone important in her life. Hannah cleared her throat. "Lily, do you remember the man from last night? The one who helped you with your umbrella?" Lily nodded. "The one who got all wet?" Alex smirked. "Yeah, that was me." Lily tilted her head. "You look drier today." He chuckled. "That's usually the goal." Hannah let out a quiet breath before turning to her daughter. "Sweetheart, there's something really important I need to tell you." Lily put her crayon down, sensing the shift in her mother's tone. She looked up, waiting. Hannah hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "Alex, he's your dad." The words hung in the air, almost too heavy to process. Alex held his breath, watching Lily closely, searching for any sign of understanding. For a few seconds, she just stared at him, her little brows furrowed in thought. Then she asked, "Really?" Alex nodded, his voice softer than he expected. "Yeah. Really." Lily blinked, then turned back to Hannah. "Like a real dad?" Hannah swallowed. "Yes, baby. Like a real dad." Lily's small fingers curled around the napkin she had been coloring on. She looked at Alex again, studying him with the same focus she had given her drawing just moments ago. "Where have you been?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He glanced at Hannah, who looked down at her coffee, as if she couldn't bring herself to say anything. Alex inhaled deeply. "I didn't know about you, Lily. If I had, I would have been here sooner." Lily didn't say anything right away. She just stared at him with those wide, knowing eyes, and for a second, he wondered if she would tell him to go away. Then, just as quickly as she had gone quiet, she picked up her crayon again and slid the napkin across the table toward him. "You can color with me if you want." The breath he hadn't realized he was holding finally escaped. He picked up the crayon, turning it between his fingers before glancing at Hannah. She was watching them closely, her expression unreadable. Lily tapped the napkin. "But don't mess it up." A slow smile spread across Alex's face. "I'll do my best." As he leaned forward and started to color, he realized something. This wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't going to magically make up for 6 years in a single conversation. But Lily wasn't pushing him away. And that was more than he could have hoped for. Alex hadn't known what to expect after that first meeting with Lily. He had walked into the cafe feeling like a stranger, uncertain if she would even want to speak to him, but when she handed him that crayon and told him not to mess up her drawing, something shifted. She had let him in, even if just a little. That small moment had been enough to convince him of one thing: he wasn't going anywhere. The next day, he found himself standing outside the small apartment building where Hannah and Lily lived. It was nothing like the luxury high-rises he was used to, but it was well kept, with flower pots lining the small balconies and the faint sounds of a television drifting from an open window. He hadn't been invited over, not exactly, but after leaving the cafe the day before, Hannah had reluctantly agreed to let him spend more time with Lily. As he raised his hand to knock, he hesitated. This wasn't a boardroom, and there was no contract to negotiate. This was his daughter, a child he had never known, and now he was standing on her doorstep, hoping to earn a place in her life. He took a slow breath and knocked twice. The door opened a moment later, and Hannah stood there, looking both surprised and wary. She glanced at the time on her phone before looking back at him. "You're early." Alex smirked slightly. "I figured that was better than being late." She sighed but stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment was small but cozy. The walls were lined with colorful drawings, some framed and some taped up haphazardly. A few stuffed animals were scattered on the couch, and there was a faint smell of something sweet in the air, cookies, maybe. "Lily's in her room," Hannah said, crossing her arms. "She doesn't know you're here yet." Alex nodded, running a hand through his hair. "How is she?" Hannah hesitated. "Quiet. She's thinking about things. She asks a lot of questions, but that's just how she is." He could hear the protective edge in her voice. She wasn't going to let him hurt their daughter, not emotionally, not in any way. And even though he was still furious that she had kept Lily from him for so long, he respected that about her. She had raised their child alone, and that couldn't have been easy. "I just want a chance, Hannah," he said, his voice low but steady. "That's all I'm asking for." She studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right. You can go in." He followed her down the short hallway until they reached a small bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, Lily was sitting on the floor, carefully arranging a row of dolls in a neat line. She hadn't noticed them yet, too focused on whatever imaginary world she was creating. Hannah cleared her throat gently. "Lily, sweetheart, you have a visitor." Lily looked up, her blue eyes widening slightly when she saw Alex standing in the doorway. She stared at him for a moment before tilting her head. "You're back." Alex smiled, stepping inside. "I said I would be." She considered that for a second, then nodded as if approving of his answer. "Wanna help?" She gestured toward the dolls. "We're having a tea party, but one of them doesn't have a seat." Alex raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" Lily pointed to a doll with curly brown hair and a bright yellow dress. "Her. She's new, so she doesn't know where to sit yet." Something about the way she said it made his chest ache. Slowly, he lowered himself onto the floor, sitting across from her. "Well, I think we can figure that out." Lily handed him the doll, watching carefully as he adjusted her place in the lineup. She studied his work for a moment, then nodded in approval. "That's better." Hannah leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a small but unreadable smile on her lips. Alex caught her watching but said nothing. He knew what she was thinking. She was trying to figure out if he was serious about this, if he was really going to be there, or if he would walk away the moment things got hard. He wasn't going anywhere. Lily poured imaginary tea into tiny plastic cups, then handed him one. "You have to hold it fancy," she instructed, demonstrating by lifting her pinky in the air. Alex smirked, mirroring her movements. "Like this?" She giggled. "Yeah. That's the fancy way." For the first time since meeting her, he saw something different in her expression. Trust. It wasn't big, not yet, but it was there. And for the first time in his life, nothing in the world felt more important than earning it. Alex had spent his entire life making deals, building an empire, and ensuring that nothing was ever left to chance. Yet, somehow, he had found himself sitting cross-legged on the floor of a 6-year-old's bedroom, carefully balancing a plastic teacup between his fingers as he took part in an imaginary tea party. It was surreal, and yet, at the same time, it felt like the most important thing he had ever done. Lily was completely in her element. She arranged her dolls in precise positions, adjusting their tiny plastic cups and making sure each one had an equal amount of pretend tea. Every now and then, she would glance up at him, as if gauging his participation, silently deciding if he was truly playing along or just humoring her. "Are you having fun?" she asked, her small hands smoothing out the skirt of her favorite doll. Alex set his cup down carefully and nodded. "I think this might be the fanciest tea party I've ever been to." Lily giggled, clearly pleased with his response. "It's 'cause I planned it really well," she said proudly. "Only the best tea parties have cookies, but we ran out." Alex glanced toward Hannah, who was leaning against the doorframe, watching them with her arms crossed. He could see the way she was studying him, the way her expression flickered between amusement and hesitation. She was waiting to see if he would break, if he would get bored and decide that playing pretend with a child wasn't worth his time. She didn't know that nothing in his life had ever felt more important. "I think I can fix that," he said, turning back to Lily. "What if we go out and get some real cookies?" Lily's eyes lit up instantly. "Really?" Alex nodded. "Absolutely. But you have to promise to pick the best ones." She grinned. "I always pick the best ones." Hannah straightened slightly, her expression shifting into something more cautious. "Alex." He met her gaze, sensing her hesitation. She was still trying to protect Lily, still trying to figure out if this was all temporary. He couldn't blame her for that. "I just want to take her to get some cookies," he said softly. "Nothing more." Hannah exhaled, her fingers tightening around her sleeves. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. "Okay." Lily cheered and immediately grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the door with more strength than he expected for someone so small. "Let's go, let's go." He let her drag him along, a small chuckle escaping as he followed her outside. Hannah grabbed her coat and keys, clearly not letting them go anywhere without her, and within minutes, they were walking down the street toward a small bakery a few blocks away. The rain had stopped, but the pavement was still damp, and the sky was streaked with the last hints of fading sunlight. Lily practically skipped ahead, holding on to both of their hands as she swung her arms excitedly. "I like this place," she said, pointing at the bakery as they approached. "They have sprinkle cookies." Alex smiled. "That sounds like the best kind." Lily nodded seriously. "They are." When they stepped inside, the smell of fresh bread and sugar filled the air. Lily immediately pressed her hands against the glass display case, scanning the rows of cookies with intense concentration. The young woman behind the counter smiled at her before glancing up at Alex. "She looks like she means business," the woman said with a small laugh. Alex smirked. "She's a professional." Lily turned to him with an exaggeratedly serious nod. "You have to pick wisely." He crouched down beside her, lowering his voice as if they were making a top-secret decision. "Which ones are the winners?" Lily pointed at a tray near the center. "The sprinkle ones. And maybe the chocolate chip." Alex stood and gestured to the employee. "We'll take a dozen of both." Lily's face lit up, and Hannah, who had been watching quietly, shook her head with a small smile. "You're going to spoil her." Alex glanced at her. "She deserves it." Something flickered in Hannah's expression, something softer, but she didn't argue. Once the cookies were packed into a small box, Alex handed the bag to Lily. She held it carefully, like it was something precious, and for a moment, she just stared up at him, as if trying to understand something. "Hey, mister," she asked after a moment. Alex raised an eyebrow. "Yeah." She hesitated, shifting on her feet. "Are you gonna be here tomorrow?" His chest tightened, and he didn't hesitate for a second. "Yes." Lily studied him for another moment before nodding as if deciding to believe him. Then she grabbed his hand again. "Okay. Let's go eat cookies." As they walked back to the apartment, Alex felt something settle inside him. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. This was the beginning of something real. Alex had always believed that relationships, whether in business or life, were built on trust. But trust wasn't something that happened overnight. It had to be earned, piece by piece, moment by moment. And right now, he was standing in the middle of Hannah's small kitchen, realizing just how much work he had ahead of him. Lily was sitting at the table, happily munching on a sprinkle cookie, her feet swinging beneath the chair. Her hands were already covered in crumbs, but she didn't seem to care. She looked completely at ease, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to have him sitting across from her. Hannah, on the other hand, was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching him carefully. She hadn't said much since they got back from the bakery. She was letting him be here, letting him spend time with Lily, but the tension in her shoulders told him that she was still waiting for something to go wrong. Lily took another bite of her cookie and tilted her head at him. "Do you have a house?" Alex blinked at the unexpected question. "Yeah, I do." Her brows furrowed slightly. "Is it a big house?" He hesitated before answering. "It's pretty big." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "Is it lonely?" The question hit him harder than it should have. He had never thought of his house that way before. It was sleek, modern, and meticulously designed, but it had never felt lonely to him, at least, not until now. "Sometimes," he admitted. Lily licked some frosting off her fingers, considering his answer. "You should get a fish." Alex chuckled. "A fish?" She nodded, completely serious. "Yeah. They don't talk, but they're good company." Hannah let out a quiet laugh from the counter. "Lily has a thing for fish." Lily beamed. "I do. They're my favorite." Alex leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "What if I don't know how to take care of a fish?" Lily gasped, as if he had just admitted something scandalous. "That's so easy. You just feed them and talk to them so they don't feel sad." He smirked. "So I'd have to talk to the fish?" Lily nodded, then reached for another cookie. "Yeah. Otherwise, they get lonely, too." Something about her innocence, her simple logic, made his chest tighten. He had spent years surrounding himself with the most powerful people in the world, people who spoke in deals and contracts and negotiations. But here was this tiny girl, casually explaining to him that loneliness could be solved with something as simple as talking to a fish. Hannah finally spoke. "She's got a point. You do tend to talk to yourself when you're thinking." Alex glanced at her. "That's different." Hannah shrugged. "Not to a fish." Lily giggled, delighted by the idea. Alex let out a slow breath, watching the two of them interact. They had their own rhythm, their own little world that he was only now stepping into. And for the first time in a long time, he wanted in. "Maybe I'll get one," he said finally. Lily clapped her hands. "Can I help you pick it?" Alex smiled. "Of course." She grinned, completely satisfied with this turn of events. Hannah shook her head, but there was something softer in her expression now, something less guarded. Alex leaned back in his chair, watching Lily as she happily talked about all the different kinds of fish they could get. She was letting him in, little by little. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to rush a single second of it. Alex had never thought a trip to a pet store would feel like such an important moment in his life. Yet here he was, walking beside Lily as she led him through the aisles, her small hand wrapped tightly around his. She was practically bouncing with excitement, her eyes scanning the tanks filled with different kinds of fish, pointing at each one as if she were a seasoned expert. "That one's too small," she said, stopping in front of a tank filled with tiny neon fish. "And that one swims too fast." She pointed to another. "And that one looks grumpy." Alex smirked, glancing down at her. "Grumpy?" Lily nodded seriously. "Yeah. You don't want a grumpy fish. They don't like company." He bit back a laugh, glancing at Hannah, who was watching them with amused eyes. She had stayed mostly quiet during the trip, letting Lily take charge. It was obvious she was still processing how quickly things had changed in the past week, how suddenly Alex had become part of their world. He knew she was waiting for him to mess up, to back out, to decide this was too much for him. He wasn't going anywhere. Lily gasped suddenly, tugging on his hand. "That one." She pressed her little hands against the glass of a tank near the center of the aisle. Inside, a small blue betta fish swam lazily, its fins trailing behind it like silk. Alex crouched beside her. Why that one? Lily grinned. Because he looks fancy. And he's blue, like our eyes. Something in his chest tightened at her words. Hannah exhaled softly from behind them. You're really doing this, huh? Alex turned to look at her. You sound surprised. She shifted slightly, crossing her arms. I guess I am. I just didn't think you were the type to get a pet. Alex glanced back at Lily, who was now happily talking to the fish through the glass. I wasn't, he admitted. But I also wasn't the type to have a daughter. Things change. Hannah's expression softened, but she didn't say anything. A few minutes later, the employee carefully scooped the fish into a small plastic bag, handing it to Lily. She cradled it carefully, looking up at Alex with bright eyes. He needs a name. Alex thought for a moment. What about Finn? Lily tilted her head. Finn. She said the name a few times, testing it out before nodding. I like it. As they walked toward the checkout, Alex noticed how naturally Lily held onto his hand now, as if she had always done it. It was such a simple thing, but it meant more to him than he could explain. Hannah must have noticed too, because when he glanced at her, she was watching them with something unreadable in her eyes. After they paid for the fish and all the supplies they needed, they walked back outside, the cool afternoon breeze brushing against them. Lily skipped ahead slightly, holding the bag with Finn carefully in both hands. Alex turned to Hannah, his voice lower so Lily wouldn't hear. You still don't believe I'm staying, do you? Hannah sighed, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I want to, Alex. But I've done this on my own for 6 years. I don't know how to just let you in. Alex didn't hesitate. Then let me prove it to you. She looked up at him, her brown eyes searching his, looking for something, maybe reassurance, maybe certainty. Finally, she nodded. Okay. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a promise wrapped in flowery words. But it was a step. And that was all he needed. The following week, Alex found himself standing in Hannah's small apartment, carefully watching as Lily leaned over the fish tank, her nose nearly pressed against the glass. Finn, now settled into his new home, swam lazily through the water, oblivious to the importance of his presence. Lily had spent almost an hour making sure everything was perfect, placing the tiny decorations exactly where she wanted them, adjusting the water temperature with Hannah's help, and even whispering to Finn to make sure he felt welcome. Alex had never seen a child so invested in something so small. But maybe it wasn't just about the fish. Maybe this was her way of processing everything, of adjusting to the fact that she suddenly had a father in her life. Hannah leaned against the kitchen counter, watching from a distance. She had been quieter than usual that evening, and Alex could tell she was still struggling with the shift in their lives. She had spent 6 years believing she had to do this on her own. Letting him in wasn't going to happen overnight. Lily finally turned away from the fish tank and skipped over to the couch, climbing up beside Alex without hesitation. The first time he had come here, she had been hesitant, keeping her distance, watching him carefully as if trying to figure out if he was real. Now, she flopped down next to him like it was the most natural thing in the world. She leaned her head against his arm, letting out a small sigh. Finn likes his new home. Alex smiled. I think so too. She glanced up at him. You'll take good care of him, right? He nodded. Of course. You'll have to check on him sometimes, though. Make sure I'm doing everything right. Lily grinned. I can do that. Hannah walked over then, sitting down on the other side of the couch. She didn't say anything at first, just watched Lily as she rested against Alex. There was something vulnerable in her eyes, something that told him she was still afraid to believe this was real. Lily yawned, her tiny fingers curling into the sleeve of his shirt. Can we do this again tomorrow? Alex felt something tighten in his chest. Before he could answer, Hannah spoke. Not tomorrow, sweetheart. Alex has work. Lily frowned slightly, but she didn't pull away. Will you come back after? Alex met Hannah's gaze over their daughter's head. He knew what she was waiting for, knew that this was the moment that truly mattered. I'll be here, he said firmly. Every day. As long as you want me to be. Lily considered his words for a moment before smiling, satisfied. Hannah exhaled slowly, glancing down at her hands before finally speaking. I'm trying to believe this is real, she admitted softly. Alex reached over, resting his hand lightly over hers. It is. She looked up at him then, and for the first time since he had found out the truth, he saw something shift in her expression. Not hesitation. Not doubt. Hope. Lily's small voice broke the silence. Daddy? Alex's breath caught. He had heard her call him that once before, but this time, it was different. This time, it felt like she knew. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. Yeah, sweetheart. Lily yawned again, her eyes fluttering closed as she snuggled closer to him. I'm glad you're here. Alex closed his eyes for a moment, letting those words settle deep in his chest. He had spent his entire life building something that he thought mattered. He had believed success was measured in power, in wealth, in control. But sitting here, with his daughter curled up against him, with Hannah finally letting her walls crack just a little, he realized he had been wrong. This was what mattered. And he wasn't going to waste another second of it. The ending of this story is both heartwarming and deeply satisfying because it's not just about Alex discovering he has a daughter, it's about redemption, second chances, and the power of choosing family. Alex starts as a man who seemingly has everything, wealth, power, and control, but through Lily, he realizes that none of it compares to what he's been missing. His journey isn't just about claiming a title as her father, it's about proving, through actions rather than words, that he is someone who will show up, day after day, no matter what. Hannah's role is just as vital. She isn't just an obstacle or a love interest, she's a mother who has spent 6 years protecting her daughter the only way she knew how. Her hesitation isn't about punishing Alex but about ensuring Lily isn't hurt. Watching her slowly let him in, allowing herself to hope again, is just as powerful as Alex's transformation. But the real heart of the story is Lily. She's the bridge between them, the innocent soul who simply wants love and stability. Her quiet trust, her willingness to accept Alex without question, and the simple way she calls him Daddy at the end, that is what makes the resolution so emotional. This isn't a story about a man who suddenly becomes a father overnight. It's about earning that place, about healing old wounds, and about realizing that family isn't about the time you've lost, but about the moments you refuse to miss moving forward. The final scene, where Lily falls asleep against Alex, is a perfect representation of that. It's not dramatic, it's not grand, it's just real. And sometimes, the quietest moments are the ones that mean the most.